last for 45 minutes with questions and answers at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the session on the CSS's YouTube channel. At the end of the session, there will also be a short questionnaire, so please do take the time to fill this out. Now, without any further delay, I'm pleased to announce that we're rejoined by Dr. Chris Englefield. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Carl. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for coming back for the people who were here yesterday. Welcome to people here for the first time. So I'm not going to reintroduce myself. You'll see the reason I'm doing this on the YouTube video recording if you don't already know. I'd like to get straight into the presentation. Yesterday, if you recall, we looked at an incident in the state of Anshar. Slight technical problem, here we go. So I'm going to start off today reflecting briefly on what happened yesterday, and then tell the alternative story that occurred in the alternative state of Alt Anshar. And it's a different story, as you will see. We're going to look at why it was a different story by examining the arrangements for emergency management in the state. That's the bulk of the presentation, but I will conclude with some personal observations on all of this, and then provide you with some references for further reading if you want to develop your interest. So if we can just quickly test Mentimeter. I've just spotted a mistake in my slide there. If you could, as yesterday, go to www.menti.com, not Mentimeter as on the screen there, it's an error. If you can go there, as many of you did yesterday, there is a test message. How do you say happy birthday in your language? For many of you, it's going to be happy birthday, I know, but can we just have some responses on www.menti.com, please. You will need to enter the code, which today is 88185161. Here we go. I'm not going to try and pronounce those. I'll probably make a complete mess of it, but we have a number. Feliz aniversario. I can probably manage that one. Hi, Ralph. Happy birthday. Good. It seems to be working. That's encouraging. Thank you for that. Oh, more coming. I like these word clouds, I have to say. Oh, we've got some more. I don't recognize all these languages, but it's really nice to see the responses, so thank you. Okay, that's great, thank you. Let's go back to the presentation and press on. We've looked at the results, we know it's working. So, our objectives today are to review the learning outcomes from yesterday and to demonstrate how the concepts of emergency planning and preparedness are an essential part of a security culture. There's a reason the word security is in brackets. And the whole point of this, from my point of view, is to facilitate the sharing of best practice, good practice at least, and approaches to physical protection in the broadest sense across different organisations, different countries and regions. I'm offering you some insight into what happens in the state of Alt Anshar, and as you may guess, it happens elsewhere. So in this session, I'm going to tell you a different story, different from yesterday, although you'll recognise if you were here yesterday that it's very strongly based on events. It's a parallel universe, if you remember, so it's going to be very similar. So this is also a fictional account, and this time though it's the tale of an effective security culture that was used in a major incident and has been developed for use in major incidents in Alt Anshar. So let's go to onto the second session and visit this parallel universe, the alternative of Anshar. First of all, in yesterday's session, we looked briefly at the potential consequences of a radiological accident or a malicious act. We looked at two different potential threats to the state of Anshar. One was that radioactive materials entering the steel supply chain, and the other one was to do with terrorism, the weaponizing of radioactive sources into, for example, a dirty bomb. We saw something of the effect of poor leadership on the prevailing culture of an organization, and we focused on, just more or less chosen at random, the Customs and Border Control Service of the state of Anshar. I briefly mentioned, and I will come back to it again today, the importance of practice, of exercises as we call them. And I mentioned the idea of emergency management and its integrated emergency management. And I mention this to you because it's one approach that has been found to be effective in Anshar and elsewhere, as I said, and it may provide some thoughts or ideas that you find useful in your own context. So you might recognize some aspects of the fictional state of Anshar. You'll recall it's a complex society. It's previously based on tourism, but increasingly moving to manufacturing and high-tech engineering. So it's landlocked. The capital city is U2, and the Larcenian River provides a route to the sea for maritime imports through the state of the neighbouring state of Athirat. And there's a rail network which connects the major port of Plinj to the rest of Anshar. And you'll recall that as there was in Anshar, in Anshar, there's the Shapash Nuclear Research Institute to the northeast of the capital, U2. Now in Anshar, the president has achieved a great deal in terms of attracting foreign investment, and Anshar is thriving. And he's a very outward-looking, open-minded president, and he's undertaken a number of state visits to other countries around the world to look at emergency preparedness overseas. And as a result of his visits and his own interests, he has made, in 2019, a decree, the presidential decree entitled Emergency Management in the State of Anshar. So let's have a brief look at this. You'll see the crest of the state of Anshar at the top of the decree on the right-hand side there. And when the decree was made back in 2019, the press office of the president released a statement. And basically, it explained that what the decree does is to make emergency management a duty of all relevant authorities of the state. And his aim is to establish an effective culture which ensures that the state, the industries, and above all, the citizens of Anshar are protected by the mitigation of risks and effective collaboration should something happen. And a key part of his decree is the requirement for training. So the decree has established a National Emergency Management Training College. So what is emergency management? Well, this is a bit broader than perhaps you were expecting. The title of these webinars has been about incident response for radiological incidents. And in fact, what I'm talking about is wider than that. I'm talking about the concept of emergency management, which includes actions before an incident and the response to the incident and actions to recover from the incident. And in one way or another, all of these issues are covered in this webinar and in the President's decree. So What we're talking about is things that happen before an incident, things that happen during an incident, and things that happen to recover from the incident. And the various components of these are listed in the contents page of the Presidential Decree. So let's look at a summary of the principles of emergency management in Alton Shah. You'll see listed in the left-hand column a number of facets, a number of aspects of emergency management. And basically, we can divide the concept, the idea of emergency management into two parts, maybe three: emergency preparedness and emergency response and recovery. So we're now talking about anticipating incidents, anticipating incidents by looking at the hazards in a state, in a jurisdiction, assessing those hazards, undertaking a risk assessment, taking actions to prevent them, preparing for things to happen. And then we move into the true response phase, and after that, the recovery phase. So this is, if you like, what I'm proposing as the way to think about emergency management. It's more than just response. And in fact, it's clear that response is just a small part of the picture that we really need to be painting here. Response only happens, ideally, after the emergency preparedness items have been addressed. So if we're talking about security culture, I would argue that what we need is for the security culture to address all of those aspects, those in the red rectangle there. Security culture must extend over all aspects of those. Now, we'll come back to the definition of security culture in a little while. So let's go back to Mentimeter. I should have asked you another question, so I'll do that first. And then when you've had an opportunity to think about what I've just told you and perhaps forgotten, I'll ask you a more technical question. So if I can make this work.
Hi, Chris. I think if you click on the screen, it should progress.
Yeah, it's not for some reason.
If you press left or right on your keyboard, does that help?
Yeah. So the question I forgot to ask you, thank you, Carl, was, were you present at yesterday's webinar? This is just something I should have done at the beginning. Good. So I think we probably would have expected that the bulk of people were present yesterday. And for the currently one person who wasn't, then I would strongly advise you to look at the recording of yesterday's webinar. That's good, that's fine. If only 10% of you weren't here yesterday, then I think it's reasonable for me to carry on as I plan to do so. So let's go on to the next question. So emergency management is about preparing for an incident and responding to an incident, and what? Someone's got their response in very quickly. I know this is hugely challenging for you, but just checking you're awake, really, that's the thing. Right, I think it's clear that most people would agree that emergency management is about preparation, response, and recovery. Now, the one person who put culture may be the person perhaps who wasn't here yesterday, so there'll be an opportunity to catch up. Thank you for that. Let's go back to the presentation. So I've listed these aspects of emergency management, and I would like to spend a lot of time explaining what they are, but I simply can't. I haven't got the time. So I'm just going to very quickly summarize them so you have an impression, but you can follow up the detail if you're interested using some of the references from the UK, which I'll provide at the end of this presentation. So the first one was anticipation, if you remember from the table. And anticipation is about horizon scanning. It's about looking around and identifying what the potential hazards are in your jurisdiction or your state. So that sounds ambitious, but if it's delegated out in the context of a state, for example, to local government, it can be done, it has been done. It's not quite as ambitious as perhaps you might think. Then, having noticed where the hazards are, they're quantifying the risks associated with those hazards and assessing them. How likely is the identified hazard to cause an incident of some kind, and what's the likely scale of impact? So if we've done a risk assessment, the next step is prevention. Is there anything we can reasonably do to prevent this risk that we've identified from actually happening? Now, in some cases, it might be that we choose to remove the risk altogether. It could be, for example, I don't know, that large quantities of chlorine, for example, have been stored in the state, they're no longer used. One way of reducing the risks of an accident involving the chlorine is simply to dispose of the chlorine and not import anymore if it's not being used, if it's not required. So there's an element of prevention. It may not be possible to completely remove the risk, so we may need to reduce it as best we can. We can mitigate the risk by planning our response. And planning the response means getting all the information we need in place before an incident happens, so that we're ready, we're prepared, we have preparedness. Response is the implementation of our plans, putting in place the response using the technical skills and resources of all the participant organisations. And at a certain point in the incident, things will become under control. And so I'm suggesting that we can think of this as a new phase. The incident is effectively over, but there's disruption that's resulted. And so recovery is about regaining normality and overcoming that disruption. So in very brief summary, these are the aspects of emergency management in that table, just so you have some insight, and you can read much more about it in some of the references. So all of these things together are known as integrated emergency management in the state of Altenshire, and by the way, also in the UK. It's called integrated emergency management because it's integrated as a system. All the principles, all those aspects work together, but they're also, and this is an important part, integrated across all the disciplines involved. The point is that all of these principles apply whatever the hazard, whatever the emergency or incident that might happen. So the same approach is taken and the same training is delivered for the various organisations that might be involved. And they're not just government organisations. So there are things you might expect, like police, fire service, ambulance service, customs in our case, local government, regulators, but also perhaps commercial organisations like the port operators we spoke about, the rail operators, the airport operators, maybe even flood prevention experts. You'll notice many of these have got very little to do with security, and certainly most of the time, nothing at all. But they are all trained with the same basic approach. And the approach of integrated emergency management focuses on consequences before looking at initiating factors and causes. So, to give you an example, if we look at the social disruption that occurred in Anshar yesterday, with the confusion and panic in society because of the rumours that were going around about a radioactive source being out of control in the state of Anshar, the consequences of that was disruption. And if the incident had escalated and been a lot more serious, then based on some of those accident scenarios that we mentioned at the start of yesterday's presentation, we could expect maybe hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of people coming forward to be checked. That sort of disruption, that sort of number of people with health concerns, welfare, well-being concerns that crowd of concerned people could be caused by any number of types of incident. It could be flooding, it could be chemical release, a nuclear issue, it could be even a major traffic accident could produce many tens at least of people who need to be managed. So the consequences are common, whatever the initiating fact, whatever the cause of the incident. Now, each discipline brings to emergency management their own technical expertise. The police, fire service, ambulance, they obviously all have different skills, but they would share a common understanding of integrated emergency management. And by following the sorts of principles that I'm talking about, they will have developed a similar level of skill. They'll be talking the same language, basically. So to put all of this in place is a very ambitious objective for the President's decree. And to be honest, it doesn't happen quickly. It's over 2 years ago now that things were starting to put in place. And one of the very early aspects was the establishment of an emergency management training college. And this now, 2 years later, provides a range of courses, some of which are listed here. There are more than what's listed here. But an important thing I would like to point out, apart from the first one, which is what you might expect, is that there's a need to train senior staff, the strategic managers. They should not be assuming that they don't need this training. Business continuity is about protecting the organizations involved in emergency management. Sorry about the typo there. Any disruption could equally affect any of the organizations involved. So business continuity is an important part of protecting their ability to respond. And then there's a number of other smaller courses for specialisms. Now, one that I would like to point out to you is the bottom one, which is continuous improvement methods. Continuous improvement, looking at how well the response to an incident went and trying to do better, or at least be prepared to do better next time, is an intrinsic part of all this. So, why is it that training in emergency management is so important? Well, you may think this is obvious, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, because these things, in my experience, don't get mentioned and clarified often enough. Now, the first thing is education, which is part of training, is about sharing knowledge, and that's important, and that's fairly obvious. But less obvious are the benefits to the individuals and the organizations that come from not just education, but training. Training is about, for me, is about developing skills, not just knowledge. So education, knowledge gain is part of it, but practicing. And if you remember, we talked about the idea of practicing using exercises, simulations of incidents for training, particularly joint training with multiple organizations involved. This sort of practice improves competence. That's what it's for. It's to develop the skills of people, but also develop and improve the processes that the people are using. Now, I would argue from my experience that this phenomenon of exercising, of rehearsal, has a tendency to harmonize cultures. It brings people together. By developing their competence, we improve their confidence. Most of the time, they will be better prepared if they've been trained to deal with what they encounter. They will be stretched, but as experts, they're able, if necessary, to go beyond what they've experienced before because they're well trained, they're competent, and they're confident. And I think it's essential that managers assigning staff to training courses and trainers realize that the confidence which comes from competence reduces stress and increases effectiveness. So I would argue that the human side of all of this is just as important as all the other aspects. Morally, even more important. Training is as much about looking after the responders, that everybody involved, the planners who support them before they actually respond, all the people involved. It's as much about looking after them, reducing their stress, and one of the benefits of that is increasing their effectiveness. But it's as much about looking after those individuals, because very often not only will they be responding to one particular incident, but they'll be expected to be able to respond into the future for other incidents. And if the confidence and competence is high, they will be much more resilient and better able to deal with things that come along. So training is not just about learning a new process, it's about looking after the individuals concerned who constitute the teams so that we can better deliver a good outcome for the task. So we need to bear in mind all the time, in my view, that training is about looking after the task, looking after teams, and looking after individuals. This is a little different perhaps from things that are routinely said, but I believe these are important aspects of the value of training. So you'll remember early on the term security culture was in brackets. Well, security culture is important to this program. It is by definition the Nuclear Security Culture Program. It's NSCP. And the program works internationally to strengthen the security of nuclear materials and things of that nature by reducing the possibility of nuclear terrorism and associated risks. But I would argue in the real world context, nuclear security risks and other risks coexist. And distinguishing between the different types of culture is not always, well, I've said appropriate, but it's certainly not always necessary. Now, I don't think this is going to work, but we'll see, shall we? Safety and security, in my view, are very much two sides of the same coin. It did work. So it's important to realize that during a response, the difference between, for example, a safety culture and a security culture is certainly exists, it's certainly there, but actually what matters is the significance of an effective culture. It's professionalism is perhaps another idea that works here. So it's really important to understand various aspects of culture. In my field in radiation protection, there's been a lot of work done in the last 10 years or so looking at safety culture. In the security field, security culture is still very much an ongoing interest and concern of organizations involved in nuclear security. But actually, in the midst of an incident, it's the behavior of people based on those cultural issues which matters more than making the distinction between safety and security in real time. I'm very pleased with that coin spinning like that. I've been looking for something like that for a long time. So just to reinforce that point, on the left here, you see a diagrammatic version of safety culture. And do you know what? On the right here is a diagrammatic representation of security culture. And they do actually, they will superimpose. So understanding security culture is really important, because if we understand it, we're better able to develop this idea that we're striving towards, which is an effective security culture. But actually what matters to us most of the time when we're in response mode is a successful outcome to our response to the challenge that we've been offered. And just as important as that is that if we don't have a successful outcome, or perhaps not a fully successful outcome, then we do something to improve. And we do that automatically because it's part of our culture. It's part of safety culture, it's part of security culture. continuous improvement is the professional thing to do in every instant once it's over and people have the chance to reflect on what happens. So let's go to Mentimeter. There's a question there which has 3 potential answers, only one of which is correct. So let's go back to the next question. Enter the code again, if you would, and tell me which of these is correct. Interesting. Well, I've heard people often say that security culture is always more important than safety culture. And I've often heard people say that safety culture is more important than security culture. It is important to distinguish between safety culture and security culture in order to understand the concepts and improve the behaviours and the attitudes of people who are of concern to us, the responders in an incident, in our case, involving radioactive material. But the correct answer is that in my view, at the operational level, it's not usually necessary to distinguish between safety culture and security culture. So I would argue that the correct answer is the one that most people chose. But, you know, it's just a matter of opinion. I've certainly seen many arguments between safety practitioners and security practitioners about which is most important. I would say actually what matters is a good outcome. So let's press on. If you remember, we're talking about the state of Alt-Anschauung, strikingly similar to Anschauung. So, once again, the Customs Department of the Ministry of Finance have the task of operating border monitors to protect the state, to protect the steel industry and manufacturing industry, which is becoming increasingly high-tech. And there are concerns, obviously, about security as well. And in order to address both of those potential threats, there are detectors located on major road and rail crossings around the national border. Now, those locations are only manned part-time, same as in Anschauung. However, all the detectors which report telemetrically to the Customs Department in the capital are checked continuously by dedicated staff. There's a small control room. And they recently had a so-called tabletop exercise when a few experts in the field sat round together, were presented with a hypothetical incident and looked at what could be done to improve the arrangements. And they decided to install an image capture system on all the detector systems around the country at the borders. And you can see the image capture system on the right-hand side at the bottom there. So a minor recent change in their arrangements. All Alt-Anschauung government departments have an emergency management department. It's part of the outcome of the presidential decree. In Customs Department, in Customs, the department reports to the chief officer, there she is, talking to senior staff on a number of items. This is an annual report on things like liaising with other authorities and organisations, risk identification, risk management, which includes assessment and mitigation, emergency planning, how the response arrangements are developing, recovery planning, staff training and succession planning, what the security threats which have been encountered through the year have been based on a summary, an unclassified summary of the National Threat Assessment, and what's been done to continuously improve the activities undertaken by Customs on incident response. And as in Anschauung, Customs in Alt-Anschauung receive a generous annual budget for this, and the project manager is very conscientious And he always ensures that he divides appropriately his budget between hardware and training and exercises, because he recognises the importance of training and exercises. To be honest, it's partly because regular exercises are required by the presidential decree. So the programme is being extended, new equipment is being installed, and transport nodes around the country to improve the arrangements. But every time there's a new set of equipment installed in a new location, appropriate local stakeholder organisations are given quaint visits and briefings. Very high level, they're not given any details about security issues, but they're made aware that the equipment is there, what it can do, what it can't do, and how the other authorities would work with it. So the staff in the small control room have arrangements in place if they do detect a signal. Basically, in summary, they would call the Shapash Nuclear Research Institute, SNRI, to investigate for them. This will be very familiar to you. And then in this alternative universe, on the 18th of May 2021, a train left the port of Plinge at 5:30 in the morning. At 5:37, the duty customs officer in the central reporting control room received a signal indicating that there was a cobalt-60 source on one of the containers on this train. Having noted that and looked at the spectrum and understood that the spectrum indicated it was a real signal, the duty officer contacted immediately his counterpart in the National Rail Operating Company and found out the itinerary of the train. Once he'd done that, he then contacted the National Radiation Emergencies Committee, and a few minutes later, he was able to transmit the picture which he'd received automatically from the image capture system to the police control room. So by this time, the train has left Plinge and entered the rail network, but because of the contacts with the rail operator's office, they know where it's headed. There's an arrangement in place in Al-Tan Shah that each government department which could be involved in a radiation incident has one member of staff who's on call to promptly review information as a group, each department in brief telephone conference to find out which organisation should take the lead. And they make that decision within 12 minutes of being mobilised by the central control room. So at 3 minutes past 6, they're in a position to say, this could be a terrorist incident because we know that the Al-Tan Shah Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre has recognised there is a potential dirty bomb threat to the state. So this is a situation where the police need to lead in case this is actually a terrorism incident. For the next hour and a half or so, all the organisations led by the police are mobilising their response. And by 7 minutes to 8 in the morning, a team, multidisciplinary team, arrive at the depot in U2 and meet the train in an area which has been set aside for any instance involving rolling stock on the railways. At the same time, 9 other stakeholder organisations are notified. Clearly, Shapash and SNRI have been notified. The regulatory body, because there's radioactive materials involved, medical staff in case of issues, the coordinator of the press office arrangements across government, and the security service have also been notified and are mobilising. Because of the notice they've been given, they're able to issue an up-to-date need to share intelligence report to the various stakeholder organisations. This is a very lightly classified, if not unclassified, summary of intelligence information which can't be shared in detail, it would be too sensitive, but a high-level summary can be shared with all the organisations that have a need to know. They recognise that sometimes there's a need to share intelligence of this kind. By this time, the government's press centre has prepared and just issued a statement to the normal media organisations. So what's their concern? Well, by 9:10 in the morning, they were provided with a lot of background information about the potential for security risks, just the fact it could be something of concern for security, and the fact that it's radiation that could be harmful. They're given regular updates every half hour or so. By 2010, the media have concluded that whilst there's something happening, there's something which they see as more important. They have limited resources, and the fact is the Rolling Stones are on their final farewell tour, and they're arriving at the airport in U2 today. So most of the reporters and most of their equipment are already deployed. And to be honest, this incident that's going on on the rail system in U2 doesn't seem that significant. It doesn't seem to provide a reason to make that a higher priority than this historic visit by the Rolling Stones. It's just routine police and government work. So they're kept informed, but they're not overly excited about this. Now, the consignment was tracked by the rail operator to the border crossing with Nabu, where it was stopped. And at 8:10, SNRA were able to verify that the signal was from one particular ISO container, the one that had been imaged by the image capture system. And after due reflection and planning of their process, they entered the container under controlled conditions and found a drum full of brass fittings, which included a cobalt-60 salts, which is probably of medical origin. The costs of remediation and waste disposal were shortly estimated at a large sum of money. And unusually, at 11 o'clock, the consignee of the shipment came forward and offered to pay. The regulatory body who was involved was aware of this and very quickly recognised that this was unusual. They couldn't explain it, but it was in some sense suspicious, so they spoke to the police. The police suspected that the reason that the consignee had offered to pay was there was something else hidden in the ISO container. So half an hour later, they investigated the ISO container further because it was safe now, the radioactive material had been removed. And there was a lot of metal scrap in there, but also a hidden stash of heroin. So they took judicial action, and days later, after conviction, the whole drug smuggling ring was exposed. By midday, there was a debrief, what's sometimes called a hot wash-up, a prompt review of what had happened once the incident had been formally closed. And it was concluded there'd been no harm to anyone, basically. And because it had been managed very well, there's no social disruption. So Alton Shah remained calm, apart from the Rolling Stones concert anyway. So the consequences, well, there'd been no terrorist involvement, there'd been no harm to the public or to staff involved. And there was no evidence that cobalt-60 had entered the steel industry supply chain. Management of the media and the effectiveness of the response, which had been planned, had been well coordinated, well prepared for, and very open, had meant that the media hadn't found this a particularly spectacular issue, and they were distracted by the Rolling Stones, which they saw as more important. It all went very well. However, a review found that there were some recommendations. There was no information, up-to-date information about population densities in the region which might have been affected. And some of the planners had been using that for planning the health responses. So it was recommended that local government emergency planners updated the database of population densities. There were some issues about people with security clearances. So there was a recommendation that there should be perhaps more security clearances available, more security cleared staff available. And it was also found that the profile of the responders was getting on a bit, lots of grey hairs. And so a programme to recruit and train younger replacements was advised. So the response had gone well, but not everything was absolutely right. There was a need for further improvements. And this idea of continuous improvement is really important because it enables things to be hopefully run smoother next time. And you may have encountered the idea of the deeming cycle for continuous improvement: plan, do, and check, and act, which is a fairly well recognized approach to this sort of thing. It should be part of the culture of responding organizations. The whole report on this was shared with 34 other stakeholder organizations in accordance with a national intelligence sharing protocol, which had been put in place fairly early on after 2019's presidential decree. So you'll recognize a lot of commonality with yesterday, but once again, this story isn't real, but there are elements, strong elements of this, which are based on my experience in the real world. You may be skeptical because it's sort of, it's an ideal situation. You may feel that this incident couldn't have been foreseen, and I would tend to agree with you. But things like this have occurred several times around the world. But more to the point, what we can say is that irrespective of the initiating event, the organizations involved had practiced and planned working together. And if your organization, in my opinion, if your organization is inward looking and tends to have a culture of protecting its own interests, working in isolation without developing a tradition of joint working, then I'm afraid eventually you're going to fail. We tend to live in complex societies which need complex solutions, and no one organization can provide that all the time. The graphic is meant to represent different organizations bringing together their pieces of the jigsaw, which together provide a cohesive whole. So an excellent way of working together is to have these simulations, these exercises to practice response and identify problems to continuously improve. There's a safe environment for staff to develop in, and there's nobody who has dominance, if you like. It's really good for team building, and I would argue that it's important to have a social component in these exercises. An overnight stay, for example, with some sort of dinner or reception is a good way of building relationships. And I happen to believe that relationships between responders who may one day be working together are an important aspect of culture building. I'm not saying this is an argument for everybody being a generalist. All the specialisms have their own skills and roles. They need to be maintained. But what I am saying is there's an argument for relevant professionals to work jointly within an effective culture. And that culture is developed over time by practicing, by common training in the principles of integrated emergency management, and indeed by working in response to perhaps smaller incidents. Because very often an incident or an accident or an emergency, whatever you want to call it, is within the scope of our, what we expect to happen. It's within the scope of our skills and resources, and we can deal with it. But if it's major or even catastrophic, or has the potential to be catastrophic, and I would suggest that, for example, having 100,000 people come forward saying, I might have been exposed to radiation, will you check my health, please? That's pretty catastrophic. That is beyond what we would normally expect. It's beyond our resources. And we're going to need some help. And it's very useful if those that we ask to help our own organisation understand our role as well as their own. And that includes understanding our culture. And to some extent, we would have a shared culture. So one way of achieving that is having worked together. And one way of working together is by sharing training, exercises, and sometimes these smaller scale incidents. One of the things about the police is they're dealing with things all day and every day, and they become very competent in these matters. Some of the other organisations, instant response is less frequent. So exercises, simulations are very useful ways from time to time of developing competence and developing confidence. So for the last time, let's go across to Mentimeter. That's not what I wanted. I can get there. I'll just give you a little bit of time. It's not going to work for me. Right, let's try that now. No, oh, what a shame. Sorry about that. The last
Hi Chris, it's Carl here. You can't press left or right on your keyboard again.
Thank you, yeah. Right, so final Mentimeter question, which for me is quite high risk. Is there anything that you might change in your emergency response practice as a result of these webinars? Are there any ideas that you think you'd like to spend time thinking about? So you should see, when you get into Mentimeter, a box which enables you to just write a few words, maybe 3-4 words, the things that you might improve. Let's just have a couple of minutes and then we must finish. Working better with other stakeholders. That's heartening. Very pleased about that. Any more? It may be a little early to have asked this question, but I'm grateful to the one person that has made a response. Better communication, certainly. Legislate to enforce cooperation, a duty to collaborate. Well, I think that's a good thing to do, personally. It certainly is providing leadership at the top. Improving communication, prompt response and collaboration with relevant lateral groups, good risk management. Regular tabletop exercises, drills and scenarios. Excellent. So I'd like to think that for some of you at least, there has been some ideas. Get all leaders to do more. I do think that's important. The difficulty that you're going to have is convincing leaders that these things matter. I certainly experience a lot of inertia amongst leaders who have many other things to think about as managers, and particularly senior managers. Getting them to take this seriously and buy into it is a challenge in itself. Things don't happen quickly. Let's go back now. So I have provided on the next 3 slides, which I'm not going to talk through, a list of publications which I think you might find useful if this is new or at least different for you. Some of these are UK government publications. Others are particularly useful documents from the IAEA and WINS. And if you're not all, the IAEA publications are available for free from the IAEA website in electronic form. And the WINS publications are available for free if you join as a member of the World Institute for Nuclear Security. It's cost-free. And there are just a few things here that I've found which I think might be useful background reading. They were available 2 or 3 days ago. And they, I think, reinforce some of the things that I've been talking about, from views of journalists reporting things which happen in the real world. ACIS is a security professional organisation, and the Centre for Public Integrity has expressed some views about the importance of sharing intelligence in a need to share sort of way, i.e. making judgments about information that must be shared rather than protected on the traditional need to know basis. Right, I've gone on longer than I had hoped to, but we do have just a few questions, time for a few questions, if there are any. So back to you, Carl.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. That was a great presentation there. And I particularly liked your turn of phrase, a tradition of joint working. And I know we're talking about a cultural change here in many cases, and you've emphasised this doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And particularly, I mean, it takes, I like the word tradition because it takes a long time to embed any tradition. And ideally that would be the standard. But I really enjoyed that turn of phrase, and thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I'm pleased that it was of use to some people.
Excellent. Just ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please do use the Q&A box. It's just at the bottom of Zoom. If you have any there, I can read them out on your behalf. Chris, I guess one question before we go to the questions, just while people are filling that out. I think maybe let's go back to the role of leadership. I know you've said there you found a lot of inertia or complacency, or especially amongst the senior leadership team. In this scenario, we have a presidential decree. So there's obviously very high leadership buy-in. But is there a way of influencing or encouraging senior leaders, departmental leaders, to engage in this, in your experience?
Big question. I mean, there are ways. I found it difficult. In my career, there was an organizational change. There was huge cultural change going on for other reasons, because the creation of a new organization from many separate ones. And the reality for me was that the senior management had many, many other things on their mind, and their mindset was, well, this is the job of emergency planning managers, not of directors. And for probably something, for years, 7 years maybe, I kept plugging away with papers and trying to influence people, trying to recruit. If you can pick them off one at a time, recruit your own director, and then get him or her to try and influence the others. They tend to listen to each other, in my experience, more than they do their more junior staff. And it's always a challenge. But one thing, sadly, that will always work is if there is a major incident, if there's something which attracts political attention, and this is what happened in the UK. For us, it was major flooding, actually, which influenced senior people and the politicians above them to think about changes and investment. Now, in the UK, the Emergency Management Training College had been in place for many years, but my organisation accessing that was a cultural change largely triggered by real incidents which were making directors think, oh, we really ought to do better. So the least good way of influencing them is just pointing out how badly something has gone. They don't like to hear bad news very often, but if you keep plugging away, even starting as a middle manager or a junior manager, you can eventually, I believe, succeed if you talk to them in the sort of language they want to hear.
Excellent.
Continuous improvement is a very good term to use.
And a good thing to strive to. Thank you, Chris. Have another question from Bill Lee, I think on a related note, although I'm aware this might be outside your immediate expertise, but your thoughts would be appreciated. So a question from Bill. The pandemic exercises of a few years back showed deficiencies in our potential to respond, I guess in the UK scenario, but it wasn't acted upon. How do we ensure outputs from exercises are acted upon?
Well, that is a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I think first of all, by instilling, by creating the sort of culture we're looking for, and bringing the need for improvement, as I said previously, to the attention of the senior people. Now, in the UK, I think what happened was probably what I referred to earlier. Other political issues, which I won't list, were bigger issues in the minds of the politicians. And the only way you're going to get their attention is when something goes wrong. So I think it's up to the most senior people, the chief executives, the senior managers, the most senior managers, continuously to point out to the politicians that their eye has come off the ball. I mean, I was a sort of at the top end of middle management in my organisation. I wasn't a director. I wasn't working with politicians on a day-to-day basis, but they are. And if you can get them behind your message and get them to point out the risks that politicians are taking, I think that's all you can do. And sadly, and as we've seen, it's happened with coronavirus, sometimes they still don't listen. But for coronavirus in the UK, we have a public inquiry coming up next year. And I would be surprised if the media, the opposition party, Parliament let actions from that public inquiry slip, because if you've got a governance system which brings the government to task, then things will eventually get done. But it really is a long, hard slog. It's important to realise we're enthusiasts for all of this. We're experts in security and emergency planning, whatever it is. But politicians and very senior people are very much generalists. And the difficult bit is getting this on their agenda. But if you can get it on the agenda, they will do as much as they can ever do.
No, thank you, Chris. And I know certainly before you emphasised the importance of speaking in their language. So framing incidents, and even if it's something tangential, perhaps a flooding incident, it's not immediately relevant to nuclear radiological, but it does highlight the consequences of what happens when it goes wrong. So
absolutely, yes. And there are many things which happen on a regular basis which could be used to drive through change in our particular field of interest.
So yeah, so appeal to the individuals, appeal in their language, and keep at it. I think that sounds like the.
Yes, I'm retired. I'm in two minds about whether to say this or not, but sometimes the media can be quite helpful.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. I'm going to leave it there because I know we're over the hour. Yeah. But Chris, thank you once again for taking us through the both realities of the Anshar Republic here. Just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We really hope you did enjoy today's session. We've got another survey, so please do take the time to fill it out. We really want to hear your feedback, and especially on the two-parter format of the webinar, whether you enjoyed it, whether we should repeat sessions over 2 sessions, or stick to the traditional format of 1. So there's a survey in the chat link there, and we'll also send that around. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us. I'm very pleased to say we're looking forward to seeing you next time, which will be next month on the 22nd of July. We're going to be joined by David Lambert from the US, who's going to be looking at safety, security, and safeguards, and the interactions and synergies of the 3 S's. So looking forward to seeing you next time. Until then, stay safe and well, and thanks for joining us. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.